Good evening. I want to begin first by welcoming you to All Souls Unitarian Universalist Church, a church whose roots stretch back 150 years, whose earliest ancestor was a suffragette, an abolitionist, and whose guiding principles of peace, justice, and equality for all adorn the walls before you. This beautiful space is a reminder that the pursuit of truth, knowledge, and community is a time-worn tradition drawn down through the years and renewed in each generation through shared struggle. I am incredibly grateful to the leadership of All Souls, to Reverend Ron Fares, to Catherine Lane, and most of all to Bart Weinberger, whose presence tonight and gracious support allows us to share this space and add our small bit to that shared history. Thank you very much. I must also thank the Henry Luce Foundation, whose generous support has helped us found the Center for the Study of Evangelicalism at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, and inaugurate this lecture series on cultures of evangelicalism, past and present. I wish to recognize our director, Jeffrey Scholes, and our associate directors, Paul Harvey and George Bayuga, whose work to found this center in this city at this moment in our nation's history represents a profoundly important investment in our ability to understand this moment we are living through when others long after us reflect back on it generations to come from now. Now more than ever, we need the resources, tools, and infrastructures of understanding that scholarship provides and our community furnishes. I wish to recognize the incredible generosity of our community, including an amazing anonymous matching donation of $15,000 that we invite you to realize by sharing whatever gift, no matter how small, knowing it will be doubled to help us ensure this center and its work can live on for generations to come. There is a guide in the fellowship hall that can help walk you through the process of giving, and of course myself and other center staff are available and happy to speak with you after the lecture as well. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening, Christopher W. Hunt, Assistant Professor of Religion at Colorado College. I first wish to extend a sincere congratulations to Professor Hunt for his recent promotion to tenure, granted in recognition of his incredible record of scholarship teaching and service. Congratulations. Professor Hunt's work considers the relevance and meaning of Black religion for those on the margins or considered outside traditional religious spaces. Building on a rich tradition of African American religious history, literary criticism, Black studies, queer theory, as well as Black, womanist, and queer theologies, Hunt's body of work explores the relationship of religion to the study of race, gender, and sexuality. His new book, Jimmy's Faith, James Baldwin, Disidentification, and the Queer Possibilities of Black Religion, released this past December, is the subject of tonight's talk. In this book, Hunt explores Baldwin's complex relationship to religious symbolism and theology, and argues we should understand Baldwin as disidentifying with the language and ideals of the Black evangelical communities that shaped him, ultimately offering us a vision of religion otherwise, one profoundly shaped by Black art and queerness, and sutured to social connection through the transformative promise of love. This past Sunday, I attended service in this very sanctuary, where, in a program focused on this congregation's ongoing pursuit of racial equity, the opening reading was drawn from James Baldwin. Quote, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." It has been striking to see how profoundly Baldwin has been transformed into a kind of secular saint, and how people who encounter him in this publicized form know little of his roots as a child preacher or his influence on the formation of Black theology. But what do we lose in Baldwin's secularization, in foregoing our understanding of his profound formation in a Black evangelical tradition, and his rearticulation of that tradition in and through his experience of race and sexuality? As Professor Hunt offers in his preface, quote, "If we are going to claim a closeness with Jimmy, if we are going to profess him as our teacher, prophet, and friend, we cannot have a piecemeal Jimmy." In this profound closeness, there's recognition of Baldwin's capacity to draw us close to him and challenge our beliefs and ideals. Jimmy's Faith offers a needed view onto how we might imagine evangelical cultures otherwise. Please join me in welcoming Christopher W. Hunt.
Good evening. Let me just begin by saying thank you to University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, and the Center for the Study of Evangelicalism, and also Ben Slidham for organizing this. A lot of work went into this, so I just want to say thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And I also wanted to note, I'm trying to do this each time I do a book event, I wanted to note the artist who designed the cover of the book, Ingrid Yuzuli Mathurin, a Haitian-American artist out of New York City, designed the cover. It's a painting called Mr. B. And so I wanted to note that. Please check out her work. It's incredible, and I feel like it ended up being the perfect cover for the text. Let me just first begin by saying that I began to seriously engage Baldwin first in graduate school. So I had a really dear friend who knew that at the time I was trying to, in essence, make sense of myself as a Black queer person, a former Christian who was also engaged in the academic study of religion. And she came up to me one day and she said, I think you should read James Baldwin. And I had read a little Baldwin here and there, and you know, in graduate school, the last thing you want to hear is you need to read something else. And so I was like, okay, all right, I will go and I will grab some Baldwin. So I walked over to the Northwestern Library and I grabbed a copy of The Fire Next Time. And it changed my life. It wasn't the first time I had read it, but for some reason when I read it that time, it rocked my world. And I began to think, oh my God, he's telling my story. Because what I discovered in Baldwin was this young Black queer man, you know, I say relatively young when he wrote The Fire Next Time, who was a former teenage preacher, like myself, who was also a Black queer person, like myself, and was engaging in one of the most profound critiques of the Christian church, making a radical connection between the history of Christianity with something even as egregious as colonialism, right? And I was like, okay, this is a person I need to engage long term, and my graduate studies all turned at that point to be centered on Baldwin. So as a religion scholar, I began to ask myself, what is Baldwin actually doing in his literature with the religious language and symbols throughout? Why is it that this man who, you know, left the church as a teenager seemed so captivated by its language and symbols? And so I became obsessed with that question. What is he doing? What is he doing? What is he doing? Why does Black Christianity seem to just have such a deep hold on him, despite the fact that he kept saying, I'm not a Christian, I'm not a Christian, I'm not a Christian, and I sure don't like Christians. So what was he doing? So and asking that question, that's how the project that became Jimmy's Faith came to be. And so I want to read a few sections of the book. I'll read the preface, a little section of the introduction, then I'll jump to the end of chapter 2, just to give you a sense of the project, and then I'm looking forward to the Q&A, hearing from you all and having a conversation with Ben. How does that sound, everyone? Sound good? Okay, all right. So this is the preface. It says, we live in a time in which everyone seems to have a relationship with Jimmy. It may seem odd and perhaps impertinent to deploy a name used by his closest friends and family, yet there seems to be that level of intimacy among those who have reclaimed Jimmy as their own, their teacher, prophet, inspiration, and friend. The man who was panned by critics, literary and political, Black as well as white, in the late 60s, 70s, and 80s, as being out of touch and past his prime, has now returned to the public arena in such a way that not a day goes by that his voice does not ring out on a social media platform, his name is not invoked on a news program, or a new piece, academic or popular, does not drop with a presumably new take on his life and work. On one level, this Baldwin resurgence should be praised. As David Baldwin recounted in the 1990 documentary James Baldwin, The Price of the Ticket, Jimmy wanted to be found again to prove himself useful long after he passed. David Baldwin remembers his brother as saying, and I quote, "I pray I've done my work so that when I've gone from here, through the wreckage and rumble, when someone finds themselves digging through the ruins, I pray that somewhere in that wreckage they'll find me, somewhere in that wreckage that they can use something that I left behind. And if I've done that, then I've accomplished something in life," end quote. One need not belabor the point that we live in a time of turmoil and wreckage. Just this past week, turmoil and wreckage. One in which we are struggling to find and sustain life in the ruins left by capitalism, anti-blackness, cis-heteronormativity, and I would add Christian supremacy. And in the midst of that devastation, Jimmy's speaking again, calling us to follow his gospel. But we must acknowledge that we lost something with the advent of the soundbite Jimmy, the Jimmy of popular culture. Take, for instance, the 2016 release of the documentary, I Am Not Your Negro. After walking out of the first viewing, although filled with joy to see my hero on the big screen being viewed by some for the first time, I knew that something was amiss. Something of Jimmy had been erased in the film. Soon after my viewing, a number of excellent articles, reviews, and reflections were written that gave voice to my discomfort, and my suspicions were confirmed sometime later as I participated in a panel discussion on the film organized by a local Black Lives Matter organization in central Indiana. After I offered my comments on the problematic erasure of Baldwin's queerness/sexuality in the film, a man stood up, a professor at a prestigious university in the Midwest, and said something along the lines of, "Listen, we need to bracket the sexuality stuff. We need to focus on the main thing," which was Baldwin's critique of race. Yes, he was gay, but that wasn't as important as his critique of white supremacy. Following this professor's comment, a Black woman raised her hand and offered, "I agree, let's stick to the point. My child isn't menaced because of his sexuality, but because of his race." There is much I could say about these comments, but what is most important for our purposes here is that these statements made clear that if we are going to claim a closeness with Jimmy, if we are going to profess him as our teacher, prophet, and friend, we cannot have a piecemeal Jimmy. We cannot have a Jimmy in whom we only engage those parts that we find palatable, sexy, and easily digestible. We need Jimmy in his complexity, or what Douglas Field calls, quote, the shifting and developing James Baldwins. We need a Jimmy who never discussed race in the United States without also pointing to the ways in which white supremacy is bolstered by an intersecting sexual, gender, and religious ideology that can only be deconstructed and combated together. This book, which engages Jimmy's faith specifically, and his engagement of religion broadly, will demonstrate that to discuss Jimmy's faith is also to discuss the theological regime which contributed to the birth of whiteness. To discuss Jimmy's faith is to discuss Western Christianity's attempt to police and control the sexual body through the creation and re-entrenchment of heteronormativity. To discuss Jimmy's faith and religion is to understand the sacrament that is queer sexuality. To discuss Jimmy's faith is to understand Baldwin's socio-political vision for a society set free from the shackles of anti-blackness and cis-heteronormativity, a reality he calls the New Jerusalem. This book is one small and inadequate attempt to see Jimmy in his complexity, to find Jimmy in the wreckage. And now I'll read a small section from the introduction. And this small section that I will read will give you kind of the background on the primary methodology that I use to engage James Baldwin's literature, which is disidentification. As Douglas Field notes in his 2015 work, All Those Strangers, The Art and Lives of James Baldwin, examinations of Baldwin's relationship to religion are a glaring absence in Baldwin's scholarship, with only a handful of full-length monographs being dedicated to the topic. This book attempts to add to the growing body of work on Baldwin's deeply complex relationship to Black religion. Why did Baldwin, a man who spoke often of having left the church as a teenager, seem unable to leave the symbols and language, the church talk, and indeed the God talk of Christianity behind? Clarence Hardy is correct in pointing out that, unbeknownst to many of those who have only been exposed to the Baldwin of popular culture, The literature of James Baldwin in its entirety remains, quote, captive to the rhythms, language, and themes, end quote, of religious expression in the United States, particularly Black Christianity. Jimmy's Faith will explore this primary question. What is Baldwin doing with and through his literary deployment of religious language and symbols? Jimmy's Faith is by no means the first text to raise this question, as the scholarship of Clarence Hardy, Douglas Field, Josiah Ulysses Young, Michael Lynch, and L. Cornegay, among others, can attest. However, the study demonstrates that in Baldwin's literature, one does not find either a rejection, a counter-identification, or an embrace, a kind of identification, with or of Christianity, but rather a strategic disidentification. Disidentification in the manner articulated by the queer theorist José Esteban Muñoz. According to Muñoz, disidentification, quote, works on, with, and against a cultural form, end quote, and is a means of transfiguring or recycling a phenomenon which is typically hostile to the queer person, recreating it as a space of queer imagination, survival, and at times, empowerment. In my reading, Baldwin disidentifies with Christian theology, for though he publicly rejects the faith of his upbringing, he continues to speak through the framework of Black church music, language, and symbols in order to challenge and restructure their meaning and articulating his own unique Black religious vision, a vision rooted in the possibility that individual humans and the culture at large can be radically transformed. In order to offer a more robust understanding of disidentification, as it will be utilized in this project, we turn now to the work of Queer of Color and the Queer of Color critique of theorist José Esteban Muñoz. Muñoz builds his distinct understanding of disidentification through a complex blending of various theories, including but not limited to Michel Foucault's theory of disidentification, which is inspired by the Marxist analysis of Louis Althusser, and the political strategy of disidentification found in the work of radical feminists of color, particularly Sherry Moraga and Gloria Anzaldua's work, This Bridge Called My Back, writings by radical women of color. In essence, these diverse theories coalesce in offering a hermeneutic of disidentification, which allows one to explore how the queer person/community takes a moment, object, or subject that is not culturally coded to connect with the disidentifying subject and remakes that social phenomena in a way that, quote, invests it with new life. And according to Muñoz, and I quote, disidentification is about recycling and rethinking encoded meaning. The process of disidentification scrambles and reconstructs the encoded message of a cultural text in a fashion that both exposes the encoded message's universalizing and exclusionary machinations and recircuits its workings to account for, include, and empower minority identities and identifications. Thus, disidentification is a step further than cracking open the code of the majority. It proceeds to use this code as raw material for representing a disempowered politics or positionality that has been rendered unthinkable by the dominant culture. In other words, disidentification is a means through which marginalized subjects, which for Muñoz are those queer persons who exist at the intersections of class, gender, sexual, and racial oppression, strategically utilize hostile cultural phenomena in a fashion that acknowledges their oppressive and exclusionary machinations while also reworking and reimagining them in ways to create the possibility for a disempowered politics. This book builds on and yet moves beyond Muñoz's engagement of Baldwin in disidentification. What will be shown is that Baldwin places himself both within and outside of Christian language and symbols. For despite Christianity's perceived failures, Baldwin's literary and political vision remains inundated with the symbols of Black Christian faith, particularly that of the sanctified/Pentecostal tradition. Rather than rejecting the symbols of the Pentecostal church in a totalizing manner, Baldwin queers them, disidentifying with and transfiguring their meaning so as to signify the flourishing of life for the very people those symbols were once used to exclude. Baldwin, although he left the church as a teenager, continues to find its language and symbols efficacious, not only in leveling his devastating critique of the anti-Black, anti-sex regime of white Christian supremacy, but he also utilizes those same symbols in his attempt at imagining and building a new world. So I'm going to skip ahead. I'm going to read to you a section. How am I on time? I'm going to read to you a section from chapter 2. As a way of framing the chapter, I want to begin with a quote from Baldwin from 1967. And this is from a letter that was published in the quarterly review Freedom Ways. And Baldwin offered this powerful statement. And Baldwin wrote this quote. In essence, he wrote this letter as he was resigning from the editorial board of a magazine that he was on. And the reason he was resigning was because of the increasing anti-Semitism of the pieces that were being produced by the journal. And Baldwin, in his commitment to radical truth-telling, was like, no, I'm not going to stand for that. And so not only did he resign, he made that resignation public, so people knew why he was resigning. But this is a statement that comes from this letter. He said, "I would like us to do something unprecedented, to create ourselves without finding it necessary to create an enemy." I won't read that one more time. "I would like us to do something unprecedented, to create ourselves without finding it necessary to create an enemy." So this chapter, in chapter 2, it's dealing with this problem, the problem in essence of peoplehood, right? And how we understand ourselves as people. Now, the first part of the chapter engages Baldwin's understanding of white identity, and I need to explain this to you, otherwise the section I read won't make any sense. So the first part of the chapter engages Baldwin's understanding of white peoplehood, white identity, which he understands to be a political, theological, and discursive creation that links racial whiteness with Christianness. But that's not all. For Baldwin, as whiteness creates itself, it also required and needed the simultaneous creation of an other, right? A racialized other, an enemy, understood in modernity as the Negro, a fantasy of the white, what he understood to be the white Christian mind. Therefore, as Baldwin sets out to deconstruct white notions of peoplehood in relation to a kind of pristine Christian identity, he also seeks to radically reassess, if not undermine, normative understandings of the Negro. For Baldwin clearly recognized that the Negro functioned as a theological construct, one that it conflates black identity with evil, sin, and suffering. So that was part 1 of the chapter. Part 2 of the chapter is Baldwin levels a critique against black sanctified churches, the Pentecostal churches that he came of age in, because Baldwin also understands that black sanctified churches created a sense of peoplehood, a kind of theological identity and community in relation to an other, but that other was a sinful, unredeemed other. So in other words, Baldwin is keenly aware of the ways in which understandings of salvation and sanctification in those black churches as well served as a means by which peoplehood was established, and it was knit together in opposition with an unredeemed, sinful, problematic other. So again, the chapter is dealing with racialized and theological understandings of peoplehood, and the section I will read will discuss how Baldwin disidentifies with both of these notions, how he grounds a sense of peoplehood in something else, okay? And if there's anything that's not clear, that's what the Q&A is for. So please, we'll get to it. So I'm reading one of the closing sections of chapter 2. It's called Suffering and Joy, Black Music and the Tonal Roots of Black Community. Throughout his literature, James Baldwin often seeks to engage and reimagine Christian theological symbols through a method of disidentification. And in the case of this chapter, he is disidentifying with the form/logic of peoplehood. What this final section makes clear is that Baldwin continues to work with and through a notion of peoplehood, but rather than rooting communal identity in what he understands to be the fiction of race or theology, i.e. salvation and sanctification, Baldwin disidentifies with peoplehood and grounds the meaning of black communal identity in black sound and song. To put it slightly differently, Baldwin understands blackness to be a matter of tone. Elsewhere he says the beat. What Ed Pavlik calls a tonal narrative and as Sean Crawley calls black tone. Therefore, black music/tone not only serves as the vehicle through which the narrative of black life in this country is shared, but black music/tone, mysteriously, is constitutive of black communal identity. However, black song/tone is not simply liberating for black people. If white people pause and truly hear the narrative carried in black sound, they might be forced into a confrontation with the lie that serves as the bedrock of their identity. a confrontation which might contribute to the deconstruction of the mythos of whiteness. For Baldwin, black art comes to signify what religion could and perhaps should be, for it can, in fact, contribute to the salvation, or as Clarence Hardy claims, the redemption of others. That redemption is found in black art's ability to both reveal the realities of suffering and struggle in human lives and create what Pavlik calls, quote, the links between as well as within human interiors, end quote, which connect human beings together in community. Baldwin speaks to this in a conversation with Nikki Giovanni, stating, and I quote, "Look, the very first thing a writer has to face is that he cannot be told what to write. But in any case, the one thing you have to try to do is to tell the truth. And what everyone overlooks is that in order to do it, when the book comes out, it may hurt you. But in order for me to do it, it had to hurt me first. I can only tell you about yourself as much as I can face about myself. You go through life for a long time thinking, no one has suffered the way I've suffered. My God, my God. And then you realize, you read something or you hear something, and you realize that your suffering does not isolate you. Your suffering is your bridge. Many people have suffered before you, and all you can do is bring, hopefully, a little light into that suffering. Enough light so that the person who is suffering can begin to comprehend his suffering and begin to live with it and begin to change it, change the situation. We don't change anything. All we can do is invest people with the morale to change it for themselves, end quote. So in other words, artistic expression is not a form of Christian salvation for the soul, but it provides a lens by which people might be equipped to change and perhaps save themselves in the midst of their suffering. However, this deeply spiritual work is not done in an isolated and individualistic sense, as evangelical notions of personal salvation often are. But it takes place through the realization that human communities are often bound and knit together through their experiences of suffering and struggle. Thus, we see here the two primary ways in which the artist and artistic creation contribute to the building and sustaining of human community. First, the artist, through their own suffering, captures the struggles of life and communicates that experience to the world. Second, in that communication, those who are suffering discover the ties that bind or link human beings to one another, i.e. the grounds of an authentic kind of peoplehood. Ironically, the artistic expression that is examined most extensively in Baldwin's work is not literature, but music, both the gospel music of the church and the genres of blues and jazz. However, it would be a mistake to draw a stark juxtaposition between the two, between black literature and black music. For Baldwin, it is black music which most powerfully expresses black literature. He states, and I quote, "What we call black literature is really summed up for me in the whole career, let's say, of Bessie Smith, Ray Charles, Aretha Franklin, because that's how it's been handed down, since we couldn't read or write as far as they knew," end quote. In Many Thousands Gone, Baldwin brings the centrality of black music in the lives of black U.S. Americans to the fore, stating, and I quote, "It is only in his music, which white Americans are able to admire because of a protective sentimentality, limits their understanding of it, that the Negro in America has been able to tell his story. It is a story which otherwise has yet to be told and which no American is prepared to hear." So what Baldwin is communicating here is that black music carries the narrative of black life, or what Sadi Simawe calls, quote, "a narrative for a story that language cannot grasp," end quote. This early nod to music's ability to communicate the story of black life in the United States matures over the years, and eventually the language of the blues becomes one of the key metaphors by which Baldwin articulates the catastrophe and beauty of black existence in the United States. Baldwin builds on this idea in his 1964 essay, The Uses of the Blues, in which he argues that when he speaks of the blues, he is not speaking simply of a musical genre, but of a, quote, "state of being out of which the blues comes." He goes on to say, "Consider some of the things the blues are about. They're about work, love, death, floods, lynchings. In fact, a series of disasters which can be summed up under the arbitrary heading, facts of life," end quote. In other words, the blues speaks to a texture, and substance of Black U.S. American experience, an experience marked significantly, although not completely, by the reality of suffering, that certain series of disasters. This idea recurs again in his last published novel, Just Above My Head, which is by far his best novel, and people can fight me on that, but Just Above My Head is phenomenal. Hall Montana, the narrator and one of the main protagonists in the novel, reflects, and I quote, "N-words can sing gospel as no other people can because they aren't singing gospel, if you see what I mean. When an N-word quotes the gospel, he is not quoting, he is telling you what happened to him today and what is certainly going to happen to you tomorrow. It may be that it has already happened to you and that you, poor soul, don't know it, in which case, Lord have mercy. Our suffering is our bridge to one another. Everyone must cross this bridge or die while he still lives. But this is not a political, still less a popular apprehension," end quote. So we see yet again that Black music, birthed out of the shared history of suffering, serves as a bridge, the medium out of which Black communal experience is shared. However, the experience found in Black music also makes Black communal identity possible. For in the experience of the performance, in listening to the rhythm, beat, and lyric of the song, comes the realization that we are not singular, isolated selves in the world, but a community knit together through a shared story of, quoting Baldwin again, love, death, floods, lynchings, the facts of life, or the facts of Black life. How am I doing on time? Good? Okay, all right. Now, Ed Pavlik, in his groundbreaking work on the role of music in the literature of James Baldwin, entitled Who Can Afford to Improvise? James Baldwin, Black Music, the Lyric, and the Listeners, also points out the ways in which Baldwin links Blackness to sound throughout his literary corpus. In discussing Baldwin's relationship to the rise of the Black Power slogan and subsequent movement, Pavlik shows that Baldwin sought to articulate a notion of Black power which rejected the, quote, blindnesses, pitfalls, and paucities of white power, principal among them the concept of color itself, end quote. In other words, Pavlik is calling attention to the fact that Baldwin offers an understanding of Black power and Blackness in general, which is more than the mirror image or reflection of whiteness. Pavlik claims, and I quote, "For him, predictably, a crucial key to reflecting Black lay in sound, not sight. If heard for what they were almost saying, the voices in the music could liberate the face of Black power from its white mask in the mirror." Pavlik continues on. Based upon a tonal narrative, a kind of code he heard deeply embedded in the sound, structure, and origins of Black music, Baldwin advocated a Black power freed from the schisms at the core of the Western myth, immune to the blindness staring back from the bottom of the whiteness of the Western well, and refashioned as a determination of a self back in touch, or Black and in touch with its selfless tonality, end quote. So a Black power freed from the logic of race/color, this notion, which might on first reading seem oxymoronic, is exactly what Baldwin sought to create. Baldwin, in his search for a reimagined peoplehood, sought a Blackness birthed out of aesthetic soil. He's explicit in naming this in his essay, Anti-Semitism and Black Power, stating, and I quote, "Black arts has nothing to do with color either. It is an attempt to create a Black self-image which the white republic could never allow. It is an attempt to tell the truth about Black people to Black people, because the American Republic has told us nothing but lies," end quote. Black art is about creation, the creation of a Black sense of self decoupled from the logic of race/color. Black art gives birth to this reality. This notion of Blackness as a matter of sound, not sight, is also articulated by Sean Crawley in his work, Black Pentecostal Breath. Crawley argues that the blues, and I quote, "The blues ain't just the lyric. The blues is enfleshment. The blues is material," end quote. In other words, Crawley makes clear that Blackness is carried in sound. Blackness is the blues in flesh. Crawley solidifies this claim by hearkening to James Baldwin's 1961 interview with Studs Terkel. In this interview, Baldwin claims that in order to write his first novel, he had to contend with being, and I'm quoting Baldwin here, "ashamed of where I came from, and where I had been, end quote. His shame in relation to his own blackness. To reconcile himself to that history, Baldwin returned to black music, specifically Bessie Smith. He recounts, and I quote, "I had to find out what I had been like in the beginning in order, just technically as a writer, to recreate Negro speech. I realized it was a cadence. It was not a question of dropping S's or N's or G's, but a question of the beat. Bessie had the beat, and I played Bessie every day. A lot of the book is in dialogue, and I corrected things according to what I was able to hear when Bessie sang and when James P. Johnson plays. It's that tone, that sound, which is in me," end quote. This is what Crawley calls black tone. And he goes on to say that Baldwin, quote, writing is not antithetical to the material force of the form that speech song takes, but must be materialized through the materiality, the texture, the weight, the thickness and intensity of vibration, of sound, of sonic force, end quote. In other words, for Baldwin to write, and in essence to recover his blackness, required his reclaiming of a tone, a sound, a song, a beat, which was a materiality of blackness, and blackness the materiality of sound. So I'm going to actually jump ahead to kind of get to, I've been talking about the relevance of this in understanding black communal identity, but what does this have to do with white folks? So I'm going to talk about white folks for a minute. This raises the question, what has all this to do with white communal identity, or the othering which produces lines of division within black religious spaces? Baldwin, in an interview with Studs Terkel, states, "If you can examine and face your life, you can discover the terms with which you are connected to other lives, and they can discover, too, the terms with which they are connected to other people. This is a very great liberation," end quote. Elsewhere, Baldwin states, in recreating ourselves, in saving ourselves, we can recreate and save many others, whosoever will, end quote. In other words, for Baldwin, one must radically assess one's life, a kind of recreation. And one medium for recreation is found in black music, which offers the opportunity for an encounter both with oneself and with the other. This confrontation provides the means by which people come to see the ways in which their lives intersect and connect with other lives. Whiteness requires the belief that black life is radically other, radically different from whiteness, and black art provides the hammer by which to shatter this illusion. As previously articulated, white racial identity requires the continued lie of innocence, one in which the white collective history of destruction, rape, and pillage is obfuscated and denied. And in our current moment, that lie is being legislated, right? Through executive order, and I'm sure acts that are going to come through Congress in which they want to entrench within our system this lie that isn't history, right? It's all rooted in a myth of innocence. As previously articulated, I lost my place. This is the reason that white people cannot, quote, comprehend the force of such a woman as Mahalia Jackson, who does not sound like anyone in Canterbury Cathedral, and are unable to accept the depth of sorrow out of which a Ray Charles comes, end quote. And just above my head, Baldwin builds on this point through the main character Hall, commenting, "If this sound always makes me think of a black cat, it is because the sound is black. It is black because the people who have betrayed themselves into being white dare not believe that a sound so rude and horrible, so majestic and universal can possibly issue from them. Though it has, and it does, that is how they recognize it and why they flee from it, and they will hear it in themselves again when the present delusion is shattered from the earth," end quote. Blackness, as found in black music, has the potential to shatter the illusions of whiteness, which in turn bears the possibility of liberating white persons from whiteness. In the music, white people are forced to engage the question and reality of the mythos that they have created, birthed in an attempt to escape what they have done and what they continue to do. Baldwin argues that, and I quote, "I feel very strongly, though, that this amorphous people, white Americans, are in desperate search for something which will help them to reestablish their connection with themselves and with one another. This can only begin to happen as the truth begins to be told, end quote. So in this confrontation with the truth of who they are, which happens through Black art, whites will no longer need the Negro, nor will they need whiteness. This is one possible meaning for Baldwin's enigmatic statement in The Fire Next Time that white people will need to, quote, become Black themselves in order to find deliverance. However, what forms of life might come out of the corpse of whiteness, if in fact white U.S. Americans are able to face the truth of who they are, is yet to be seen. All right, I will stop there. Thank you.
We get to do a bit of an awkward dance now, where I actually think we should share the lectern, move back and forth. So I have my own questions before I pass it all over to you. Yeah, and there will be a mic for Q&A down here at the front. That if you have a question, please, when we shift to Q&A very soon, we will do. But I want to turn to the question of evangelicalism within this text. You situate, for instance, within this text, the emergence of the evangelical tradition in the U.S. alongside debates around enslavement and the prevailing idea of religious conversion that existed at the time, grounded in theological education. Fear of Black uprising stymied efforts at converting the enslaved with the idea that religious education would lead to mass revolt. Could you expand on the historical and theological shifts that gave rise to the Black evangelicalism which formed Baldwin?
So that's a great question, a complicated question. So the birth of Black Christianity in this country is that's a very I keep saying complicated because it is complicated history, in which what you begin to see, and there's a common misunderstanding that there is a thing that you can call the Black church, right? And the reason I push back against that is because the Black church is not a monolith, right? It is a diverse collection of traditions, right? And depending on which Black church, which Black practitioner you're talking about, it can look very different in what those Christian faiths look like. But Black Christianity in this country has deep roots in early evangelical movements, right? Part of the reason for that comes about because of the Great Awakening meetings, right? The revivals that took off in the 1740s, let's just say there. And I might be a little bit off on my dating. But in essence, during these meetings, right, Black people began to, for the first time, encounter a faith that they could begin to get on board with, right? It was about an immediate conversion, right? An immediate experience of the divine, right? Previous to this, the groups of people that were attempting to convert slaves were Anglicans, who had a long, slow process of catechesis, right? Which it was, you're going to sit a group of enslaved people down and for months and months and months teach them the distinctives of the Christian faith. You can see why that's not going to be successful. But during the Great Awakenings, you could have an immediate encounter with your Creator, right? And make a confession of faith for that Creator, right? And be saved immediately. So you can begin to see why this appealed to African Americans. But what happened is despite the fact that there were evangelical roots to Black Christianity, it still looked different. There was a radical difference, right? There was some overlap, right? And there were some problematic things. But I refuse to say that the religion of Black people was the Christianity of the Black people was the Christianity of their enslavers. Because they began to think about a liberating God, right? A God who set free ancient Israelites, a God who crushed an empire to see slaves set free, right? Now, there's a reason why, and if you want to find the theology of early Black Christians, look in the spirituals, right? where you have consistent themes, right, of Exodus, 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 Exodus. God is a liberating God. God is a God who keeps God's promises, right? Now, this is a tradition that continued on. Eventually, it would birth what would become known as the Pentecostal tradition, of which Baldwin was deeply, deeply a part of in his formative years, right? But the Pentecostalism of which Baldwin came of age was evangelical, very much rooted in a personal experience with God, of making a confession, of repenting of one's sins, right? Now, Baldwin might leave the church behind, but one thing that sticks, that whenever I read him, I'm like, oh, wow, that evangelicalism did not let you go, is the fact that he thinks that people need to change their hearts, right? He was always suspicious of movements, but what he would say is like, no. You, as a person, have to face the lies that you've internalized. You, as a person, need to repent, which is why he joked in The Price of the Ticket that his friends told him that he had never left the pulpit. And he's like, perhaps they're right, because his message still had a kind of evangelical veneer to it, especially in its focus on the personal and the necessity of the personal, right, and bringing about change.
To build on that, you identify conversion as perhaps the most core theme of Baldwin's writing, pointing to how he narrates his own religious conversion as revealing both the promise of individual transformation and the failure of that transformation to bring about social change. How do you see Baldwin reimagining the idea of conversion in his work?
So conversion for Baldwin, and this is something that I borrowed from the work of Clarence Hardy. And Clarence Hardy was one of the, I think he's one of the best commentators on Baldwin and religion, right? He wrote a small text called James Baldwin's God. It's phenomenal. He was one of the first Baldwin scholars that I engaged as a graduate student. But I was inspired by his take on the importance of conversion for Baldwin, and I kind of built on that. And in essence, in the first chapter of my book, I argued that Baldwin is, in essence, obsessed with his conversion. Now, if you read Baldwin, whether that is if you read The Fire Next Time or you read his first novel, Go Tell on the Mountain, he narrates his conversion experience in Go Tell on the Mountain through a character by the name of John, who is really Baldwin. And he has this dramatic conversion experience in which, and if you know anything about conversion within the traditions that he came of age in, it can be dramatic. And so he was literally unconscious on the floor for a long period of time. There's this epic struggle for the soul of this young man between God's forces, Satan's forces, etc. And then the young man arises from the floor, and spoiler alert, he is saved, right, at the end of the novel. Now, Baldwin remains obsessed with it, right? It shows up again in The Fire Next Time. This time he has a slightly different take on his own conversion, saying that as he was laying on the floor of that church, he came to the realization that God is white. And the reason he thought God is white, he was like, because if God really loved us, why are black people's lives like this, right? So even at his conversion moment, he said there was a question in the back of my mind, like, do I really believe this? But Baldwin remained committed to the idea of conversion. And what I mean by that is Baldwin was obsessed with the idea of transformation, which for him required a kind of radical truth-telling. Because in the evangelical church, right, part of getting saved is confessing, right, that you are a sinner, that you are in need of God's saving grace, right? Well, perhaps there's not many evangelicals. I grew up in the church, so to me, I was confessing all the time because I was always doing something. But that's part of it, right? But for Baldwin, he's like, no. He's like, even though he left all the Christian theological stuff behind, he's like, no, there's something true, though, about the necessity of people to stop lying to themselves. And in essence, he understood whiteness as a kind of ultimate lie that has seized the consciousness of entire groups of people for centuries. And literally, genocide was happening because people believed this lie, right? And he's saying if you can tell the truth, right, that your history isn't a kind of valiant history of discovery, a valiant history of just taking land that wasn't occupied, right? A valiant history of we just made friends with indigenous people, right? If you can face the truth of that history, Baldwin said maybe you can get free. And it's always a maybe. Because Baldwin, he's like, Baldwin was an activist throughout the 60s. By 1968, the man is thinking like, I don't know if there's any hope for white folks. But he tried to maintain it. In 2025, I'm sure there's many black folks in this room thinking, I don't know, right? But he said that if this country was going to get saved, it had to face that truth. And until it could, we're all going to remain in this chaos.
Well, another core theme to turn to in Baldwin's work is that of salvation. And it's interesting to note that Baldwin, though he was formed by an evangelical faith, that he rejects an individualistic salvation in favor of a communal one which recognizes shared identity and struggle. What do you see as grounding Baldwin's shift away from personal salvation?
Well, I would say that Baldwin, he never necessarily shifts away from the personal, but he always uses the personal as a means of exploring larger social phenomena. This is something very peculiar to his work. He always kind of zeroes. This is why he uses his own narrative so often. He's like, no, if I can understand myself, then I can understand broader social issues. So he moves out from the personal to broader social structures, right? And so this is part of his methodology. But what this requires, though, this movement outwards, right, towards looking at, broader things like white supremacy and cis heteronormativity, et cetera, it requires what Baldwin understands to be a kind of mutual recognition between human beings. Until we're able to recognize, and for Baldwin, he's deeply humanist, right? If you can recognize the humanity of the other, then these systems can begin to be disruptive. In essence, for Baldwin, the reason why white supremacy can function so unchecked is that white folks don't really look at black folks. And what I mean that metaphorically, right? White folks were intersecting with black people all the time. They're working in their homes, right? They're intersecting with them on the streets, right? But he said that, Baldwin said in one place, but they don't know my grandma, even though she raised their kids. Right? They don't see her. He was like, but black people see white folks, and we know white folks better than white folks know themselves, right? But what he was saying was there's a kind of almost a kind of a mystical recognition that Baldwin articulates. If you could begin to see and recognize one another, then perhaps transformation can take place. Recognize the weight, the beauty, the ultimate value of the creature in front of you. If you can begin to do that, then perhaps something might be able to change. This is also why Baldwin leans so heavily into the erotic, right? And so, going back to the conversion piece, one thing that Baldwin will often frame sexual experiences as holy, sacred, life-transforming. And the reason for that is, one, because of the radical kind of truth that is just present with queer sexuality, right? Because it's a kind of sexuality that's under threat, right? It requires a kind of courage to engage in it in the first place. That gives it a sacred veneer for Baldwin, but also the fact that Baldwin can sometimes get a little puritanical about sex at times, but for the most part, Baldwin frames sexuality as transformative because he says that sexuality is about that recognition of the other, facing the nakedness of the other, the vulnerability that is required in engaging in sex with the other. He's like, you can have sex in different ways, right? And not recognize the person at all. But for him, that's just kind of an empty exercise. But sex can also be a life-transforming phenomenon. And he was saying that level of intimacy is required in the broader culture, right? Not that everybody needs to be having sex with everybody, but the intimacy and the vulnerability. I know that my students, whenever I bring this up, my students are like, no. We don't need to be having sex with each other. But but that's the level of vulnerability and intimacy that Baldwin is calling for.
my last question before we open it up to everybody here is that you describe Baldwin as ultimately hopeful, perhaps even optimistic about society's future, in particular through his articulation of the New Jerusalem and the hope he places in the role Black children might play. What message of hope do you see Baldwin as offering, and how might it perhaps pull us out of our own pessimism?
Yeah. Does anyone know where that language of the New Jerusalem comes from? Oh, there might not really. There might not be. Okay. So it comes from the book of Revelation. Right. So one thing you'll notice about Baldwin, if he's not quoting gospel songs, he's also often just quoting the Bible, and he has it just pasted all over his novels, and people are like, what is he doing? He loves his Bible. He always traveled with his King James Bible, despite the fact that he was saying over and over again, I'm not a Christian. He always had that King James Bible with him. But he always framed hope in relationship to this idea of the New Jerusalem. There's various ways he refers to that, but most often the New Jerusalem. And what he is saying is in the book of Revelation, which is apocalyptic literature, and there's a moment in the book of Revelation in which heaven and earth are remade, right? And a New Jerusalem comes down from heaven. And the New Jerusalem is supposed to be a space that is in radical contrast to the other symbol that had been functioning throughout the book, which is Babylon, right? Which is Rome, in essence. A space of decadence, a space of economic injustice, a space of violence, right? New Jerusalem was supposed to be a space of justice. Now, Baldwin talks about the New Jerusalem, but he does it in a profoundly queer way, right? He doesn't just let the symbol function as Christians understand it. He's like, no. The New Jerusalem is constructed by human hands. And he said, and even in one of his last interviews, he said, I believe in the New Jerusalem. I really do. And he was going to go to his grave believing that we can, and this is the idea that's rooted in it, that we can be better than we are. Baldwin, despite the fact that he saw close friends, confidants, murdered, imprisoned, that he lived literally through the fire, and he was at times becoming more and more hopeless, Baldwin still chose to hope. It's almost like faith for him. There was no evidence as to why this man should hope things would get better. Everything in the world around him was telling him it's not getting better, but he actively chose it. And it's really interesting why he says that he chooses to hope. He always looked to Black children. And he said that I can't tell my nieces, my nephews, I can't tell the children that there's no hope. Because to tell them that, for him to surrender hope is to surrender their world. And he refused to do it. And he said, Black folks have never given up hope. He was like, you want to know why I know it? You walk through the streets and there's Black kids running around, playing. That for him was one of the primary symbols like, no, Black folks have not lost hope. And they refused to give up hope. And even if he died in the space of, he died in the 80s. This was not a promising time for Black people. He still died thinking like, no, we can make things better. That was what the New Jerusalem was for him. And it's, just to get a bit personal for a moment, these past few years have not been easy for anyone. They've been particularly difficult for people out of marginalized communities, as we literally live through a pandemic, as we witness genocide in real time every single day. And being the person that I am, I have a tendency to begin to despair often. And the one thing that causes me not to is my kid. Because I tell myself, no, I could just say, I'm done with this shit. I'm done, right? I can't do this. I'm going to check out. I'm going to cash my check. I'm going to stay inside. I'm going to do my thing, and I'm going to die, right? But to do so would be to surrender his future. And Baldwin refused to do that, right? I refused to do it, right? And hope is something that has to be, in essence, renewed every single day, right? You got to actively choose it, especially right now, when there's no evidence to tell us things are going to get better, or can be better, or more just. I think we can, though, actively choose to engage through hope. Yeah.
With that, I invite those that have questions or want to carry on the conversation to come down to this mic and participate in the conversation. Thank you so much.
I was struck by this concept of the black tone. And my question, I'm thinking about blackness as an inherently queer identity, and I'm thinking of blackness as being so intertwined with Christianity, not to the exclusion of other religions. And my question is this black tone, is it possible without queerness and without theism? Christianity or theism.
Yeah. So, okay, let me start with. I knew you were gonna bring fire questions. So thank you. I do think that blackness, in and of its blackness, is when it's not trying to approximate whiteness, is profoundly queer. Right? It's an identity rooted in building, living into, creating life in the midst of a modern world that was attempting to reduce black bodies to commodities, right? It is an identity that kind of traffics, I guess you could say, over and against and under and the categories that mark the Enlightenment and modernity. I think blackness is, in and of itself, a kind of profoundly queer identity. It always exists in a problematic relationship to the norm, and that's a good thing, right? I think black communities have attempted to take on very particular white Christian concepts and constructs, right? Which has led to, the phenomenon of, which is not a peculiar black communities, it's in all communities, when you find the trans antagonism and the queer antagonism in the black community, I think it is a direct reflection of blackness attempting to approximate a kind of white Christianness. And I think that's a problem. Now, I do not think that blackness can be conflated with or requires theism. And I think what's really interesting is that what I've noticed is, so my mentor, one of my mentors in graduate school is a scholar by the name of Sylvester Johnson. And Sylvester Johnson has written one of the most incredible texts on African-American religion. It's called African-American Religious History, 1500 to 2000s, which I teased him about. I was like, how in the world did you cover 500 years in your, in your 250-page book? But he does. And, but he also wrote another book called The Myth of Ham in 19th century US America. And he says in the preface to that book that he wrote it because he was trying to understand why blackness in this country was so often conflated with Christianness. And why, when he left the church, his blackness was called into question. He's like, what is that about, right? And that's something I experienced too, right? As a person who left the black church, and all of a sudden, my communal ties were severed. Because blackness was so inextricably linked with theism and Christianness. And what he said is it has the byproduct of modernity. It is a byproduct, and I guess you could say, if you want to use the language, it's a byproduct of trauma. As black folks adopted Christianity in an attempt, not always, don't get mad at me, not always, but sometimes adopted Christianity in an attempt to participate in the US American project as an attempt to move closer to the center, right? And so we began to understand ourselves as a unique chosen people too, which is a very US American tendency to do. White folks and black folks have done that. No, we are God's new Israel, right? Right. So I think blackness does not and should not be conflated with theism, because black spiritualities, Even if you want to stretch back to West African modalities of spiritualities and cosmologies, I don't know if we can reduce those to theism. But it's a great question. Thanks.
So I am of the opinion that the institution of Christianity, and I guess I could say like what you were talking about here with Blackness and its closeness to Christianity, after having a conversation with Dr. Scholes, I kind of feel like I'm of the opinion that the institution of Christianity is the final link between like maybe understanding or like trying to, I don't want to say rid the world of racism, but I feel like it's the one thing that isn't really talked about in regards to the invention of whiteness and blackness and the role it's played in slavery and the way it's perpetuated racism over time and continues to, and now we're seeing it done through the question of sexuality and queerness, because they can't really come for, Black people anymore, like overtly like that. I mean, I guess they still are, but I don't know. I guess kind of like, what do you kind of think about that? It's really not much of a question. I just kind of want to hear your thoughts on that opinion.
Yeah. So I think, so there's a growing, that's an excellent question. Thank you. There's a growing body of literature that dives into the deep connection of Christianity with the formation of race as a construct, right? Whether that is the work, I mean, I'm kind of running through a dozen pieces in my head, but whether that is J. Cameron Carter's work, Race, a Theological Account, or Willie Jennings' work, the Christian Imagination, right? I teach a class on race and religion in the modern world at Colorado College, and one thing we talk about, and I say this to my students because sometimes students show up who, are taking the class because they're not sure, like, why is the study of religion relevant to my life, what have you, and I tell them that you can't even understand whiteness as a construct without understanding Christian logics. Christianity was, in essence, the foundation out of which understandings of Europeanness and eventually whiteness were created. So that conflation that we see even in our contemporary time within Christian nationalist movements, right? That we even see within the Trump White House itself that is attempting to conflate whiteness with Christianness. That's old. That's not new. They are reimagining a pattern, right? And even if you want to go back to, I don't know, even the hundreds of years of the transatlantic slave trade, right? One of the ways in which white people understood themselves as a unique, what would be the term? As having a right to lands, bodies, and peoples. That was inextricably linked to their understanding of themselves as white Christians, right? And the way that plays itself out looks differently depending on where we're talking about. The ways in which a kind of understanding of Christianness gets linked to bodies and blood on the Iberian Peninsula is very different than how it might have looked in medieval England. But what you begin to see is the ways in which Christianness begins to be linked with bodies and begins to get linked with color schema, right, over time. And again, that's what we're seeing right now. But I think to understand, so some of my students are activists and organizers, and I tell them, and they're doing a lot of anti-racism work, and I tell them you can't do anti-racism work without having a real sense of the history of the ways in which Christian logics and theologies allowed these understandings of race to form, right? Even in the ways in which Black people were demonized as radically other, it was done by religious means as well. And I don't want to give a lecture on the history of the fetish and all of this thing and the history of Black and the way in which Black religion served as a means by which Black people were demonized and racialized, but it was, right, in opposition to their understanding of a kind of pristine white Christianness. So I think you're absolutely right. You have to untangle Christianity's role in those things. And I would also say, too, though, that just like I said, that Black Christianity is not monolithic, I often tell my students, let's be specific about the traditions we're talking about and how those particular traditions contributed to these things, right? Because I think it's sometimes we, in a way that's not helpful, will clump all of Christianity together into a kind of large amorphous blob, but we need to tease out what we're talking about, right? And the Christianities that have always existed historically and how they contribute to varying structures of oppression. Yeah. Other questions? Thank you. Yes.
I thought it was really interesting how you talked really consistently about whiteness and blackness mirroring each other and reflecting off one of each other throughout history. And my question kind of surrounding that is, do you think that Black culture has lost itself in that opposition and trying to oppose whiteness for so long?
So I think what I was attempting to say is that there's a way of understanding Blackness that isn't rooted in what Baldwin would say is kind of I don't like to use this ableist term, but this is the term he uses, the madness of whiteness, right? What he thinks is that there was a way of understanding Black peoplehood that could be decoupled from the logic of race, which seems really strange, right? But I don't think, and I often push back against this, I do not think that Blackness is simply the flip side of whiteness. I think that white people encountered the other, and they attempted to demonize the other, and they came up with all these ideas of what the other was, right? And they created all these discourses and all this ideology and all these theologies to say what Black people were. But those people, those Black people, always had an understanding of themselves that did not require necessarily the white other, right? So Black identity cannot, in my view, be reduced to a response, simply a response to the white other. But I think that's why Baldwin roots it in sound and song and a kind of cultural production. Because what makes Blackness real for him is that Black people share a story. And now I was kind of unfair in that I only read about the suffering part, because he also says in the blues you find a kind of joy, right? That Black life is also, and the blues are also about a kind of vibrant life. In another place he calls it the sensual, right? About centering oneself and living life to its fullness, experiencing everything you can, whether that's, he says, the breaking of bread or, having a drink or laughter, etc. Like that's all the stuff of Black life, not simply struggle in relation to whiteness. So I think Baldwin is attempting to move away from understanding Blackness as a racial construct, right? He's saying, no, it is something else. This is language, call it metaphorical, that we use to describe a mode of being in the world. That doesn't necessarily have to include white folks at all. Sadly, they have to contend with white folks every day, but that's not what gives them life, and that's not what gives them meaning. And that's not what provides the building blocks of what Blackness is for Baldwin. Yeah. And I would say, too, Blackness for Baldwin develops over time. Baldwin, and you see this with a lot of figures throughout the period, and the reason why it develops over time is because Baldwin was living and writing during a period in which you move from, let me be careful. I don't want to say as though it's like a kind of radical shift, but as you move into the period of time in which the Black Power movement is the kind of the public voice of Black life in this country, there are many ways in which Blackness is coming to be understood. And Baldwin is in real time trying to think about what does it mean to be Black? Because he said, I've been lied to my whole life, and what they've told me isn't going to work. So who are we? And so he too was participating in this moment of like, let's create anew what it means to be Black. And so that's part. I don't know if that was rambly or if that answered your question. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Christopher. I'm wondering, I'm kind of thinking about when you said that he had this desire to go public with his resignation from the editorial board. And it wasn't good enough just to resign and let his friends know. And just thinking about Baldwin, there is this, I consider him one of the greatest writers of the 20th century, but he was also a public intellectual. When a lot of people like Langston Hughes, not as much, or Richard Wright. And I'm thinking, too, of the ways in which he desired to kind of confront at least white people via publicized, televised, I'm thinking of the debate with William F. Buckley. How does that, do you think, plays into a way of confronting injustice in a public manner? I mean, he was just on TV until really up until his death, unlike a lot of his other kind of peers that were maybe not as equally famous as an African-American writer. But anyway, just how does that play into in confrontation with whiteness in this public way? And I think it was at Oxford or Cambridge maybe when he did the debate. I can't remember with Buckley, but I don't know if you could speak to that.
Yeah. So I think there was part of Baldwin who always, and sometimes you get a sense of this, particularly in his unpublished letters, that there was times where you just get a sense that he wished for that private life. I think the reason why he chose to live outside of the States through most of his life was a reflection of, like, I really wish I could write and not be this public figure. But Baldwin, I think, and this is another part that I think his Christian formation never left him, was deeply committed to this idea of witness and being a witness. And being a witness for him meant I have to tell the truth publicly. He thought he had been given a certain amount of gifts, he had lived a certain story, and that he had a responsibility. And he sometimes would dabble in this language of calling, right? A calling to tell the truth publicly. And I think that's what marked him as different than some of his colleagues in the arts who were not as public, because Baldwin felt like, no, I have a very particular mandate to, in essence, prophesy publicly, to say, in essence, this is what's coming, America, if you don't change your ways. Deeply Hebrew Bible prophetic in the way that he understood his calling publicly. And I think that's what marked him as different. That didn't leave. He might have left the pulpit, right? He might have stopped preaching, but he didn't. And he would have thought that it was, and this was language he used, that he was being untrue to himself if he did not live that life, right? In essence, he felt like he would forfeit his right to live if he did not live into his mandate and his calling. Even though he didn't want to connect that calling to a God, he didn't want to connect that to anything like that. If he connected to anything, it would be love. But that was, I think, what kind of marked him as different, was this idea of witness, which was inextricably linked to this idea of being a public figure, despite the fact that he didn't want to. And he also kept recognizing that all of the black public figures kept being eliminated, right? Which only intensified in himself, I have to do this, because who else will, right? And he assumed he would die too. And I think was quite surprised when he wasn't assassinated. Yeah. Other questions?
This is hardly academic, and I'm not finished with your book yet, so I'm feeling a little self-conscious, as though you perhaps answer this, so my apologies if that's true. But it is so hard for me to accept that God is love is bound to Christian formation. It's so hard for me to accept this reliance on disidentifying, like this obsession Baldwin has with these Christian symbols, this confession. For us as a people to feel compelled to care about someone else, or to feel perhaps that truth-telling may set us free, why do we have to connect that to Christianity? It's bigger than that, right? Or what?
Yeah. Yeah.
Or, I mean, you know,
Yeah.
what's
Yeah.
up with that?
I know.
Why are we redeeming the Christian stuff? It's bigger. It just happened to be the particular shape, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Or not. Maybe you answer that. Help. Help.
No, that's an excellent question, and I think it comes to, and this is something I was thinking about pretty consistently in writing the book, asking what are the limits of disidentification? When is it necessary to have a profound and robust counter-identification with the theologies and the symbols that are trying to kill us? There has to be a point when it comes to that, right? I think there would be points when Baldwin did come to that, when he would get quite irritated and he would begin to talk about God in a quite harsh way, right? That would make Christians very upset. I think part of the reason Baldwin continued to speak through this idiom is because in this country, Black life and thought has been informed by it in a really profound way. So one of my students brought up in one of my classes recently about the connection of non-Christian Black people to the Black church. And I brought up a comment by this brilliant up-and-coming scholar at Princeton, Rebecca Wilcox, who said that no Black person is outside the Black church. And I read it and I was like, that's bullshit, I don't like that. But then I thought about it. And what it was getting to is the ways in which Black culture was in such a deep and profound way birthed out of those logics, right? So even a Black person who isn't in the Black church can understand Black church speak because it became kind of Black cultural speak broadly, right? So that's part of the reason I think Baldwin doesn't let it go, because it was in essence for him staying true to the language that formed him and the language that still animated the Black community he was a part of. And he was utilizing it in a really profoundly queer way, in a way that many Christians would be like, ooh, no, I don't like that, but he was still using their language, but he was toying with it in a very particular way. So I think that's one reason that he did it. But with your question, I do think that that disidentification can only go so far. Muñoz even says this, right? It's a strategy that works for a period of time and in very particular circumstances. But one thing he didn't want to do was make it a kind of ultimate norm, that queer folks just have to disidentify with varying things. Sometimes you have to, in a very explicit way, destroy, deconstruct, and burn the symbols. And I'm all for that, right? But for some reason, Baldwin didn't get there with them, with the symbols. He can, and perhaps part of it was like one of his last conversations he had. I think it was like a week before his death. He was talking to one of his very good friends who became his biographer, David Leeming, and he said to David, he was talking about the church, and he said, I don't believe in God. He's like, but I believe there's something out there. And then he talked about how the language of the church was his inner vocabulary. And I always found that so intriguing, because I was like, when I read that it was his inner vocabulary, I was like, that's why he couldn't think outside of it. It informed everything that he thought about until the day he died. So he had to deploy it, right? It's hard to, I think, escape our inner vocabularies, but I think it's an excellent question. And I think for those of us who read Baldwin, engage Baldwin, we also need to always leave space to critique Baldwin and know, and I think Baldwin would appreciate this, that we could push him and say like, no. I think disidentification can only go so far, right? Yeah. And is that helpful? Yeah. That's a great question.
Thank you all very much. Thank you to Christopher Hunt for the excellent book. the insightful comments, the empowerment in a time where it doesn't feel like we have that many sources of it. I thank you all for coming tonight and for participating in this conversation, and please join me one last time in thanking Christopher Hunt.